Okay, we'll get started. Hello and welcome to the Global University Climate Forum. My name is Ashley Jankowski. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I am a fellow at the Yale Office of Sustainability. I am thrilled to welcome so many students from around the world to our next session, Sustainable Urban Transitions, Calibrating Policy Across Scales. Before we begin, I'd like to read our statement of respect and inclusion. The Global University Climate Forum brings students together to share ideas, learn, connect, and act on the global imperative of addressing climate change. These are the forum principles of respect and inclusion. First, be inclusive. Strive to ensure that all feel welcome and valued. This applies to our speakers and guests, as well as our student participants. Be open. Consider ideas that challenge your beliefs. If we support and learn from one another in this diverse group, we each become stronger. Listen honestly. The forum is a neutral and safe space for testing ideas and asking questions. Work to receive rather than react. And finally, act mindfully. Bring the values of respect, inclusiveness, and humbleness into your actions as a climate activist. In the spirit of respect, inclusiveness, and humbleness, the organizers of the Global University Climate Forum acknowledge that in many cases, today's society is built on a foundation of oppression. Whether it has been through forced occupancy of land or through the subjugation of people, there currently exist deep and seemingly incurable injustices around the world. The organizers of the forum ask that all participants consider their role in advancing a new future and putting us on a pathway to right these wrongs. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two brilliant speakers. Here with us today is Professor Edgar Pieterse, the South African Research Chair in Urban Policy and Director of the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town, as well as Mr. Anton Cartwright, researcher at the African Center for Cities at the University of Cape Town. Welcome, Edgar and Anton. Edgar and Anton both have brief presentations that they will share with us, and then we'll break into a Q&A. So as you're listening, feel free to pop your questions into the chat, and we'll respond to them during that period of time. But Edgar, you have the floor.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you for including us in your fantastic program over the next 2 weeks. And it's a real pleasure for us to be here. Just to say that we will use, because the topic is rather large, we will nominate to often use African examples for today, but we're very happy in the discussion time to broaden the conversation to either examples from outside the African region or to reflect at the global scale. I'll just share my screen and then I'll get stuck into my presentation. Is that visible and clear? Great. Okay. So I guess the entry point for us is to locate the discussions around climate change mitigation and adaptation in the context of a very particular form of the urban transition in the African context. It's a form that in my work I call makeshift urbanization, because most of the urban growth and urban development in the continent is really the result or the product of the activities of urban dwellers themselves. And the reason for this is that African governments are often absent in terms of facilitating or enabling living in a dignified way within African cities. Now, the sort of two specificities that we will touch on, and something that we would just appreciate you to keep in the back of your minds as we work through material, is firstly this question of economic vulnerability and dependence. And I'll say quite a bit more about that because I think it is central to identifying what would be strategic and appropriate responses to the imperatives of climate change. Secondly, for reasons related to the colonial legacy, the form of the post-colonial governance or institutional experiment in many African countries, we are confronted today with what one could characterize as an unfit or lopsided governance framework. And as a result of these governance challenges, it is very difficult to not just understand the complexity and the range of urban pressures, but also how to respond in a strategic and effective manner. Now, I want to sort of just make one broad remark before we get into some of the details of the African urban transition. And if we want to, if you will, pull back and think of this moment where we are today, with a shift over the last 20 years or so away from neoliberal managerialism to an understanding that sustainability requires a more human-centered and an integrated development framework. And if you will, the culmination of this political and policy work being the Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted in 2015. Now, there are 17 goals with a number of targets under each, which adds up to almost 200 targets, an enormously ambitious and complex agenda for the world. But if we've got to strip everything away and really try and identify what are the priority challenges that live across the 17 goals and the various other global agreements, I would argue that it is these four things. One, work, particularly for a youthful demographic. In Africa, 50% of the population is younger than the age of 19. And so, unsurprisingly, we're going to see a massive expansion of the labor market. But this is, of course, this is most pronounced in Africa, but it's not unique to the African continent. Secondly, the climate emergency, the reason why many of you are doing this program. Thirdly, inequality, and significantly, an issue that we're only really beginning to understand now in its full complexity. And finally, something that is less concrete or less materially evident, but which I believe is almost more important than some of these other challenges. And this is the question of meaning. How is meaning constructed? And this relates, of course, to questions of identity and belonging. Now, some of the levers for change to address these, and certainly as urbanists, we would argue quite strongly for these, is rethinking the quantum of the infrastructure ask that the 21st century transitioning implies. Now, urbanization, of course, requires the investment in infrastructure, and there's a sort of a number of questions about the nature of those infrastructures, whether they're materially efficient, whether they're able to sustain a circular metabolism, and of course, whether they're low or zero carbon. You can't think of infrastructure disconnected from land use and how the value of land is captured for the commons or for the public good. And neither of those two policy interventions is possible unless there is an effective and a reflexive governance system at play, able to both understand and wield a number of regulatory tools. Of course, what we're looking for is really to figure out what could be new forms of living, cultural confidence, work mobility, connectivity, and well-being over the long durée of the 21st century. The challenge we face and why we need your expertise and your work on the ground, if you will, in different regions of the world, is that we've got to figure out how to generate these new models, these alternative models, in a context where 68% of the 7 billion people on the planet only subsist on 3% of global wealth. So in a context of enormous distortion of allocation of resources and wealth, how does one not just imagine, but instantiate alternative approaches and solutions? Now, keep that in mind, and those are also a frame that hopefully will be helpful as a reference point for some of the other sessions over the course of this program. So to turn to Africa then, and this is sort of a longer story, but I'll try and summarize it. If we take UN data, Africa is the fastest urbanizing region of the world regions that we have. But within the African continent, there's enormous variation. So what we see is that Southern Africa, Northern Africa has in some ways, because they're above the 50% urbanization mark, they have almost completed or they've matured the urban transitions. And so we will continue to see an expansion of urban populations, but we won't see a dramatic growth in urbanization. However, the opposite is true for particularly West Africa and East Africa, where we are going to see populations in general treble over the next 25 to 35 years, but the urban populations as well. And so that is very significant because you're, of course, talking about different infrastructural bases in these different African regions. Now, this is just a quick data point on slum living. And what you can see is that what we've witnessed over the last 30 years is a reduction in the proportion of people who live in slums. However, For sub-Saharan Africa, if we exclude some of the higher income countries like South Africa, you will see that it is still well above 50% of the urban population live in slum conditions. In some of the fastest and most populated countries, such as Ethiopia, which of course is very much in the news in the last week with being on the brink of a civil war, you'll see that almost 80% of the population live in slum conditions. So what this tells us is that the slum living is the majority condition in many, many sub-Saharan African countries. So just as a reference point, that's really important to keep in mind. Now, Africa's urbanization is unfolding over the next 30 to 50 years. And as I said, is one of the most rapid in the world. But this is happening in a context with very, very limited expansion of the industrial base or manufacturing growth. And so what that means is that as you've got this increase in the labor force because of the youthful population, there isn't necessarily meaningful work opportunities for these young people. Now, for us, it's important from a policy perspective to understand that this is not something that will be easily remedied. This is the consequence of a long-term trend, at least for the last 40, 50 years. And what we can see in this graph is the shares of different economic sectors. And as you can see, 40 years ago, in the beginning of the 1980s, industry was a third of the share of GDP across the African continent, sub-Saharan Africa. And that has shrunk to 25%, to just a quarter. And of course, over that period of time, agriculture has also been very modest. And the only increase has really been in the services sector. The problem with this is that services sector enhances value addition in the economy, but not necessarily employment. And so this is a structural feature that has produced a very unique labor market dynamic in the African continent. This is work from the economist Danny Roderick. And what he shows you on the left-hand side of this graph is what has been the historical experience in other developing regions, such as Latin America and particularly Asia. And what you can see is that you have the majority of the labor force in informal employment in the agricultural sector, and they transition to manufacturing jobs in cities, and from there transition into services occupation. In the African context, we see a very, very different pattern, from informal agricultural to informal manufacturing and informal services. In fact, a very small proportion of the labor market is able to access formal manufacturing jobs. This has profound consequences, and this is just a data point to demonstrate how serious, or the gravity of this dynamic, because we're expecting between 2015 and 2050, the African labor force to increase by 156% compared to a net decrease in China and a more modest increase in other populous countries like India. And you can see the comparisons with Europe and North America. So the continent with the largest labor force is confined to a situation where most people in that labor market is in informal employment. This is compounded by a further problem. Recent data tells us that only 10% of the African population is in tertiary education. Now, in a context of a transition to a knowledge economy and an intensification of automation of the production process, to have such a low percentage of such a large demographic group able to access tertiary education is, of course, going to reinforce the dynamic that I've just showed to you. So what we see as a pattern across many sub-Saharan African cities is the following systemic dynamics. One, you've got a large and growing youthful population that need work. The only work that is available, though, is low wage, precarious, and typically without any form of social protection, except for some of the upper middle income countries like South Africa and Egypt. Due to those sort of most of the opportunities being of this nature, this precarious nature, households have very low and variable incomes. And what this means practically for those households is that living in a formal house, in a suburb, if you will, is just not an option. Slum urbanism is the only hustle that is available. It is the only form of keeping a foothold within the city. Now, what we then see is low wages, of course, intersects with poor health and with climate and economic shocks. And this creates what one could call a normalization of large-scale systemic injustice in many of these cities. So if we just for a moment step back again and remind ourselves of the bigger economic picture, you will see in this graph that over the last 40 years, and these trend lines are important because they help situate what the systemic constraints are and why it's so important to take a 30, 40-year look into the future. Now, what you will see is that Africa's share of GDP per person over this 40-year period flatlined. This is despite the fact that Africa's relative share of the global population has increased significantly. And think of this trend line relative to the story of Africa rising, that this is the African century and so forth. So this is quite a sobering sort of set of data points to look at, because it reminds us that we've got to deal with an expanding population, expanding demand for employment, but in a context where the relative share of Africa's position in the global economy remains stagnant and is basically marginal relative to other world regions, particularly Asia, of course, as you can see in the slide. So sort of more conceptually, and some of the readings will elaborate on this for you, but this is sort of to kind of understand analytically what we're dealing with here. It's important to know what the constraints are so that we can begin to think imaginatively, but also concretely about alternatives and try and understand what the scope for the climate change agenda might be. Now, the first point to make is that modernist design and organizational biases, they are drawing African leaders and policymakers to examples of what I would call consumerist modernism. So there's an obsession with Singapore, with Dubai, with the Shanghai model and so forth. And I'll show you some examples of that in a second. Secondly, professional knowledge systems that unsupports, if you will, the economic modernization of African cities are stuck in sectoral assumptions. And this, of course, feeds into the professional biases. And this is which implies usually a bias against non-professional knowledges and practices of particularly the ordinary residents who make African cities. Thirdly, what we find is that these factors come together within modern state forms, hierarchies of organization and workflow, locking in vested interests, and they are compatible with rent-seeking political practices and patronage cultures. And in one of the examples that Anton will speak to, you'll see how we were trying to work with tools such as national strategies to deal with climate change or urban policy to begin to unpick some of these dynamics. Fourthly, that the distortion of power and control through the corporatization of political parties and their fundraising strategies creates negative incentives to reproduce the status quo. And what I basically mean by this is that if we, again, look at the political context in many African cities, we've got forms of multi-party democracy that's very recent, 20 years maybe, 30 years in some places. But within that, political parties have come to, if you will, take on what we've seen as the norm in, for example, the American system, right? Where private donors often control the agendas of how these political parties govern and rule. And finally, we also witness civil societies that are highly fragmented, and they kind of either veer towards militant opposition or they in these very close, intimate, cozy relations with local authorities to be partners in service delivery. And what this means is that this important and critical work of co-production is a policy landscape, is an institutional landscape that is often vacated. And again, Anton's examples will speak into how one deals with some of this. Now, this imagination that I spoke about, the Shanghais of the world and so forth, has produced a policy obsession with new town developments. So on the left-hand side, you see Quilamba, which is the most important housing real estate intervention in the post-colonial history or the post-Civil War history of that country, and was financed by the Chinese. And as you can see, the form of urbanism is very much the Chinese interpretation of modernism. On the right-hand side is an initiative in Lagos called Eco-Atlantic. And again, you can see the kind of ultra-modern skyscraper set of assumptions that inform this. And actually, these examples are just a few amongst a number. This is data that was collected by the International Newtown Institute in Rotterdam that captures all of the Newtown developments across the African continent since 2010. And as you can see in those two regions that are urbanizing at an incredible pace, West Africa and East Africa, they also have by far the largest number of these initiatives and interventions. This is just, as a little bit tongue-in-cheek. This is a billboard of Eco-Atlantic in Lagos. You can see some of those towers in the background. And this reflects the delays in the actual implementation of this new town development in the context of Lagos. And this is a photograph from that we commissioned a couple of months ago. So to summarize then, the problems with the contemporary model of running African cities is that it caters for a small proportion of the urban population, and it responds to their incomes and mobility needs. Secondly, the work of ordinary urban dwellers often gets criminalized and subject to extortion, if we think of street traders, street vendors, and so forth. Thirdly, the lack of adequate basic services, shelter, public infrastructure, and social development opportunities mean that all of this potential that is locked up with this youth dividend is effectively squandered. So in that context, there's been a lot of discussion, and ACC is very much involved in a series of processes with both policy and academic and social movements to begin to discuss and reflect on what an African approach and aesthetic might be, to beginning to engage with these challenges, but also respond to them. And one of the things that we think is a powerful hook is the formal long-term vision identified by the African Union called Agenda 2063. And the 2063 references 100 years since independence, or since the establishment of the forerunner to the African Union, which of course is the institutional symbol of Pan-Africanism. And this document, similar to many global development policy frameworks, says all the right things, but there's two ideas in there that I think are really powerful. The one is a reclamation of the indigenous knowledge systems and traditions on the continent, and the need to acknowledge and embrace that, but to fuse that, if you will, with the potentialities of the knowledge economy. And in work that was built onto this by the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, they make an argument that green industrialization would be the fitting macroeconomic response to that opportunity. And what we're interested in is how the agenda of sustainable infrastructure can, if you will, form the bedrock of this green industrialization frame. The second one, of course, is the SDGs. And here I think there are three things that are worth foregrounding, and they echo what I said earlier: inequality, environmental limits, and very, very importantly, the need to build a new global economy by rethinking and remaking both production and consumption systems. And of course, the conversations and debates around the circular economy is at the heart of what that might mean practically by sector, but also what cities do is they allow us to think at a scalar level about these sectoral transformations. So if we bring these two things together and we combine them with what I would call everyday practices and intelligence of ordinary urban dwellers who, if you will, have to engage in all manner of activities to exercise their livelihoods, if we can combine these things, we can begin to, I think, understand what indigenous innovation might mean. And what the climate agenda does, it helps us to relate the need for indigenous or contextual solutions by drawing down international thinking around sustainability transitions in relation to infrastructure, but also understanding that that has got to be grafted onto local institutions and local practices. So I'm going to conclude then by suggesting that some of these global agreements, particularly the work of the IPCC and the 1.5 degree report, has helped us to formulate the potential of national urban policies. Now, what are these things? At the Habitat 3 convening in Quito in October 2016, the new urban agenda was adopted by nation states. And at the heart of the new urban agenda is the idea of national urban policies. This is an instrument to take the commitments of the SDGs, the Paris Climate Conference, and to translate that into a program to deal with urbanization in a way that is both inclusive and responds to the climate emergency. And in the next half of this afternoon session, Anton Cartwright, my colleague, will share with you some of his work and thinking around this potentiality. And this is just to demonstrate how this fits within a number of national policies. And again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to delve into this, but in the question and answer time, I'm very happy to return to this and how one can think about the role of national urban policies in relation to other national urban policies. So without further ado, I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll immediately give over to my colleague Anton to share his portion of the presentation. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Edgar. Thank you, Ashley, and wonderful to be talking to you and to see the names dropping into the chat. Good morning and good afternoon, because it's great to see the scattering of people tuning in. So if I do my job on this, I'm going to try and pick up on the story that Edgar's told, but focusing in on one very particular urban transition, which is that of climate change. Not because that's the only one, but because it is one of the more acute challenges facing cities and facing people in cities. And in some ways, I think it's a useful proxy for many of the other ecological and social and political challenges that these cities confront. And it's useful for many reasons, one of which is that it plays out over more or less the same time frame, basically up until 2050, that Edgar was describing as the key window of the demographic transition and movement of people into African cities in particular, and I guess developing country cities more generally. And I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to try and drill down and explain how we apply some of that thinking in the country of Tanzania in East Africa. And I hope that this is useful to you because in some ways, I guess you, like us, are trying to navigate your way into a career that places you appropriately in this context. And the wonderful thing about the climate change space as it's opening up pretty much daily at the moment is that you get a choice, right? So you could work in the top left for the UN, or you could work with activists on the streets, or you could be like Riki, who's in the bottom left-hand corner there, who's someone who I work with, a green entrepreneur, mining ferrochrome out of the waste stream in the city of Cape Town, and in fact built that little machine that she's working with there. Or if you're unfortunate enough to have to convince your in-laws that you have a real job, you could even work in a bank or an insurance company right now, because they are with increasing alacrity taking up this challenge of climate change finance. And so, you know, that's what lies before you. And I hope that that's both encouraging and also slightly daunting, because you've got options and you have to find your way. So the global response to climate change is multifaceted, but it's quite neatly summarized in the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees of warming, which for my sins, I was one of the authors on. It came out in 2018. One of many authors you'll see there. And it was really a collation of the existing science to try and answer the question of, can we limit warming of the Earth's atmosphere since the industrial era, so 1750 to 1800 as the baseline, to 1.5 degrees. That was the question we set out to answer. And I will give a very brief synopsis of it because I hope that, I kind of hope that no one's read the whole thing because that would be sad, but I'll try and summarize it. One of the images that you won't find in that report, but which I still find very useful, even as someone who works in this every day, is this one, which actually comes from Cambridge University in the United Kingdom and from their British Antarctic survey. And what it shows, you can see there, is the 800,000 year relationship between CO2 in the atmosphere and temperature. And if you're wondering how this is measured, it's through ice cores, which take water isotopes as a proxy for temperature, and then water bubbles, which tell you what's going on in the atmosphere, water bubbles captured in the ice. So I think you don't have to be a statistician or an econometrician to see some sort of relationship there, right? And a relationship that's held reasonably constant over the last 800,000 years. But what you don't get from this image is what's happened in the last 50 years, which is this. Okay, we currently sit at 416 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And so I think it's fair to say that no matter what you do, you're going to be working in a time, and we're all entering a time of what I call a radical uncertainty, which, by the way, is the title of a fantastic book by John Kay and Mervyn King. But the general principle applies as well. So we're in uncharted territory here, and that should have implications for you, no matter what your discipline, no matter what your career, no matter what your aspirations. So what about that 1.5 report? What did it say? Well, again, a very brief synopsis. We're currently at 1.1 degrees of warming, which means we hit 1.5 degrees around 2040. Actually, and this was missed in a lot of the rapportage around the report, is that we were very clear that it is still geophysically possible, isn't to limit warming to 1.5. There isn't so much momentum in the system that we're going to crash through that target regardless. But to do that, you'd have to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 45% by 2030, and you have to be carbon neutral as a planet, as a society by 2050. And the other thing we said about this is that the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees, which is a number that you hear much more often cited in the climate change literature, is actually quite significant in terms of the impacts. And so we listed down the right-hand side just some of the differences between 1.5 and 2. And one of the more emotive ones for people is that at 1.5, there's still some coral reefs left in the world, whereas at 2 degrees, they simply aren't. But that's a projection spanned out to 2100. And more importantly, if you are going to aim for 1.5, and this is again something that's in the report but quite difficult to pick out, you basically have an option between putting your fate in the hands of a technological fix, and particularly what the report calls carbon dioxide removal. Right? So this is basically the sucking of CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it somewhere where you hope it stays safe for a little while, somewhere like maybe a deep saline aquifer. Or doing wholesale socioeconomic change. And the report is quite clear that if you don't do much of the socioeconomic change, much of the behavior change, then you're going to have to suck 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere by 2100. Whereas if you do the socioeconomic changes, that then becomes just 100 gigatons by 2100. Now, those are probably numbers which don't mean a whole lot to you, but in my own head, I can kind of imagine 100 gigatons. That's more forests, some soil carbon, maybe a little bit of tech fix. 1,000 gigatons, to be honest, is a completely geo-engineered world that personally, sitting here, I can't get my head around. So that's broadly the choice. And if you are going to do the big system transitions, and the report is very clear that you have to focus in on land use and agriculture and forestry, industrial systems, energy systems, and then importantly for this conversation, urban systems. And of course, this requires not a massive increase in your investments, but it does require just 1.5 to 2.5% increase in energy sector investments, for example. but it does require a massive shift of your current investment. So the divestment, reinvestment argument applies very much in this case. And then in the final chapter of the report, we're very clear, and of course this coming from this image, which actually comes from Cape Town, where Edgar and I sit at the moment, is very clear that the only way you can achieve both the pace and the scale of the socioeconomic change, which you require if you're not going to put your faith in the technological fix, is to simultaneously address inequality and poverty at the same time. So the one way that I like to think about that is you cannot, the goal is not to decarbonize poverty and inequality. You have to use the decarbonization process to address poverty and inequality for reasons that I think many of you will understand quite intuitively. It's no point in telling somebody that they should worry about emissions in the atmosphere in 2050 when they don't know how they're going to feed their child tonight. So you have to try and combine the solutions to those problems. It's a massive change. One way of thinking about it is through this graph. That's more or less what it looks like. The different lines, colored lines on the right-hand side, are simply different scenarios with different probabilities attached to them. But all four of them, I hope you'll agree, is very different to the black line, which is our historical trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions. So there's work to be done here. But because that report came out 2 years ago, it's worth reflecting a little bit on what's happened since, and how much progress have we made. And I think there are some positive signs. This is certainly what I look to when I'm having a glum day. Renewable energy prices have fallen precipitously, and storage technology improves pretty much daily. I like to think, never always got to be careful on this, but I like to think that the coal lobby is in the corner simply for financial and reputational risks. So I think we're going to see the increasing phasing out of coal in the next few years, and increasing difficulty in raising finance for coal-fired power stations. In fact, that was one of the things which happened in Tanzania while I was working there. And then I think on the financial side, it's no longer possible for fund managers who manage global savings to say they didn't know, right? And so I think we're going to find litigation cases around gross negligence for people who continue to back fossil fuel assets which might become stranded by climate change over time, either biophysically stranded or reputationally or regulatory stranded in a way. And there are currently 500 litigation cases taking place around the world, climate litigation cases in particular. And of course, then the final point, which is one quite dear to us in South Africa, because in some ways this country was transformed by a movement which started with the youth. We've seen youth involvement, Extinction Rebellion, and of course, there she is, the Joan of Arc of our time. And I like to think that South Africa provides a good lesson that you ignore youth movements as a politician at your own peril. And so this isn't going to go away. So what about urbanization? Because as Edgar teed up, we've got to do all of this, which is not trivial, at the same time as dealing with this massive demographic transition of people into cities in the developing world over quite a compact time period as well. And if you look at this graph, it suggests that this is a problem, right? I mean, the broad question is, whether this urbanization trend can help us in our quest to tackle climate change, or whether it's actually going to make it more difficult. What this graph shows you is on the vertical axis is greenhouse gas emissions, and on the horizontal axis, the degree of urbanization in different countries, developed countries being the blue dots, middle income countries being the black triangles, and least developed countries. It's terrible language, we know that, but that's just, let's just use it for now, being the blue circular dots. And basically what it shows is that it would appear to show anyway that the more urbanized you are, the higher your greenhouse gas emissions. So if countries are urbanizing, that suggests we have a problem. But actually what this shows, and I haven't done it in this graph, but it's very easy to do, is if you strip out GDP per capita, all that this picture actually shows is that when you urbanize, you tend to experience an increase in income, and that income correlates with increased consumption. And it's actually the consumption, not necessarily your income, which drives this apparent increase in greenhouse gases. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves is whether we can imagine and then construct ways for poor people to lift themselves out of poverty, which don't correlate or which decouple from greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, that is tricky to do. This is just to give myself a little pause, but this actually is quite profound. I find it profound in some ways, even as humor, because this stuff is hardwired into our aspirations and into our way of life and into what Edgar referred to as the ways in which we construct meaning, often through materials. Yeah? And so how do we confront this? And let's be quite clear that this has not been done before. So this is an image which you might have seen before. On the bottom is the Human Development Index, which on the right-hand side of the horizontal axis is high human development and supposedly happy people. And on the vertical axis is ecological footprint. So the top of the vertical axis is countries that consume much more than a sustainable amount of ecological and environmental resources. And I mean, conspicuous in this picture is the fact that the sustainability quadrant, which is that shaded quadrant on the bottom right-hand side, is vacant, right? And so no country at the moment is managing to marry this twin challenge of meeting people's wants and needs and at the same time remaining within environmental limits. And the key question that we confronted when working in Tanzania is, can we take the yellow dots, which are your African countries, and move them to the right, without, so I increase people's standard of living without crashing the environmental limits, right? And of course, the kind of compelling idea here is that as African countries, or even as many developing countries, we can do this thing called leapfrog, right? Which is, we can satisfy needs and wants without repeating some of the mistakes of industrial countries, particularly environmental and climate change mistakes. And maybe it's easier to do low carbon growth than to try and do decarbonization retrospectively. That was the mindset or the challenge that was put to us in Tanzania when they asked us to work on their national urban policy through a donor-driven project. And, you know, not to over-stylize, but, you know, thinking about this challenge in terms of sort of good news and bad news. And on one hand, the fact that it's all still to do in African cities, as shown in that, in these bullets here, presents a sense of opportunity, right? But of course, as Edgar has already touched on, at the same time, in this highly stylized sense, there are also structural deficits to doing this stuff well in African countries in particular, and Tanzania is something of an exemplar of those countries for the reasons that Edgar touched on, right? And so you have to try and balance these. Is the fact that we have such low car ownership in African countries, just 6% in 2012, certainly still below 10%, I believe. Does it allow you to leapfrog to a kind of a mobility phase that doesn't depend on private vehicle ownership, for example? And so this was our task in Tanzania, which is, some of you might know very well, I'm not sure, but for those of you who don't, Tanzania, East African country, rapid economic growth, rapid urbanization, particularly to one city called Dar es Salaam, which is not the capital, but it's certainly the primary city, and also a highly centralized politics. In fact, a deep suspicion from the incumbent political party around cities in general, because indeed that is the place where political opposition is going to incubate. And so there's a sort of reluctance from the center, from national government, to invest and devolve too much to cities for the very obvious reason, and I think the rational reason that that's where youth movements are going to come together and form coherent political opposition. And so how do you work in a country like that where it's politically tricky, but there are these acute challenges, and there's certainly no easy answers. And one of the mantras that we sort of told ourselves when we were working there is that if this was easy, i.e. addressing the development and the climate challenge at the same time, I guess it would be would be getting done, right? And so instead we formed what we call the Tanzanian Urbanization Laboratory, which is really this convening of an epistemic community of practitioners, academics, government officials. And the kind of defining attribute of the laboratory is that we would try and focus on the right questions before even contemplating what could possibly be an appropriate answer. Our task in this, by the way, the donor-given task was to come up with a national urban policy which was also climate resilient. But as I've said, if that was easy, it would have been done yesterday. And so we had this laboratory, and this was our metaphor. This is in, I don't know what you call this, but Bajaji in Tanzania or Riki in some Asian countries. But most of you have probably seen or heard about these. And this is how you get about a city like Dar es Salaam. And these things became something of a metaphor for our work there, because you hop in the back of one of these things, you tell them where you want to go, and the driver then navigates, right? And he never goes the same way twice. He's always factoring in flooding, traffic, potholes, your time frame, his budget, and fuel availability. But you end up at a destination, but through very iterative and adaptive navigation tools. And that's kind of what we try to do in Tanzania. So our Bajajis became our metaphor. And we ended up producing a report, which of course you have to do when given a lot of donor money, and that's available on the African Centre for Cities webpage if you're really interested in the detail. But we also spent a lot of time sort of trying to enter mindsets of people who were outside the state system and outside the formal policy levers, but for example, in this picture here, providing water services for people who were off the water grid, as it were. And trying to understand something which became very kind of central for us, which is that many of the clues for how you go about this exist in the gaps left behind by the formal state and by formal service delivery. And so we had to look there to find innovative solutions. And this is Helena Sayas, who was the winner of a competition we ran. And what she's holding in her hand is a brick that is used in construction, but it's completely made out of recycled plastic. And so very much part of the circular economy and addressing environmental concerns, climate change concerns, while providing a commodity, a brick, which is in very high demand in the city of Dar es Salaam. So that's what the roadmap looked like. We drew on all the policy levers available to us: leadership, fiscal, and regulatory and governance levers. And as I say, we can talk about the detail if you're that interested, or the report is on the African Centre for Cities webpage. And it goes into quite a lot of detail, which is what you have to do, I guess, when trying to construct national urban policy out of nothing. But one way you can think about this, and coming back to this crucial issue of service delivery and infrastructure that Edgar's highlighted, and then something that is very important for all forms of socioeconomic development, is how to provide energy, right? Because African cities in particular are energy starved. And that indeed is one of the reasons why manufacturing and industrialization struggle so much, is there just isn't enough reliable and affordable electricity available. So this is one option, and this is the kind of conventional option. You might not know, but this is the Grand Inga Hydro Scheme, a massive infrastructure project. I think it spans, Edgar, you'll know, I think 19 African countries, and it's been 23 years since it was first mooted, and it hasn't really got very much to show for it beyond this. And even here, you'll see the damage done through hyacinth weed damming up the hydro plant here. The alternative, and again, looking in the gaps for solutions, is this, right? This is kind of what's happening for people who aren't linked up to the grid, but they have just a simple solar panel from which you can charge a mobile phone on a roof. And this is increasingly being seen as a solution. And of course, the intriguing challenge then is how you stitch together these two fundamentally different approaches to the same problem. Is there an institutional and a governance hybrid that can get the best of both worlds from these? And that's not an easy question to answer, but that's essentially what you have to try and do across a range of different services that have historically been highly centralized but inadequate, and are now bubbling up through technological innovation from the grassroots movements. And the photovoltaic panel is just one of those. Okay. So what? And then this is by way of conclusion, and then we can go into the discussion. But it's, I think this question of whether urbanization is supportive or counterproductive for sustainability is open-ended, right? But basically, we don't have a choice, that we have to make sure that urbanization supports climate and sustainability goals and socioeconomic imperatives at the same time. But let's be very, very clear that the defaults, if we just business as usual, if you like, in the energy, waste, transport, building, and land and space, so spatial orientation is not towards sustainability. Right? The default is a replication of unsustainable practices, as Edgar has pointed out. And then let's also be very clear, and this is something of a talk back to a narrative which I think has come from mainly from North America, a little bit from Europe, is that cities on their own actually have very limited influence, right? They have limited budgets in developing countries. They actually have limited decision-making power. And so you have to look to multi-level governance and even multi-actor governance at the same time, right? And in fact, all cities, whether they're in the US or in East Africa, are probably better off with supportive and enabling national governments. So while cities offer many opportunities, we have to look to the multi-level governance arrangements to get the best out of cities. Right? And part of that, particularly in the African context, comes with the political commitment to cities. And where you have that political commitment, or where you can curate that political commitment, linking bottom-up and top-down political movements, then I think you have the makings of an engine for growth towards sustainability. And the way I like to think of it, just as a final cloak, is actually a quote from a colleague of ours here at UCT, Brian Levy. And this is our challenge, right? This is both the intellectual and the practical challenge, that we have to find a way that kind of threads the needle between hubris on the one end and despair, often disguised as humility on the other. And yeah, this is the sort of thing that the Urbanization Laboratory in Tanzania, for example, really grappled with. Thanks very much. I'll leave it there and stop screen sharing.
Thank you, Edgar and Anton, for those really interesting presentations. The Q&A is full of really great questions, and I'd love to get to them now. I'd like to start off with a larger concept of urbanization, some of which, Anton, you just addressed, but in the pre-session survey, a lot of students indicated that they share the sentiment that cities are not great for climate change. They are, these areas that are highly developed and with high energy consumption and waste production, and they don't necessarily see cities as a solution to climate change, and cities are not communicating their role as such. Have you seen good models of cities being able to communicate the need for green infrastructure and a green transition, and how they've changed their PR a little bit?
So Anton can maybe come in with some specific examples, but I'll make one broader point first. What we have seen is that a number of cities have formed networks where they essentially provide mutual support, solidarity, but also the sharing of almost R&D on how to do things differently so that they in fact can address the climate challenges. And one of the most notable of those networks is the C40 network. And one of the partners in the Coalition for Urban Transitions work that was the overarching frame for the research that Anton did in Tanzania and in Ghana in the African context. Other networks such as ICLEI also fulfills a similar function. And then we've seen a couple of more thematically driven programs like the Resilient Cities Network, which was 100 cities around the world, Rockefeller Foundation sponsored program. Now, so what all of that represents, and particularly if we look at the American case, where you've had a recalcitrant federal government, state level and city level governments have often taken the lead. And in fact, in the US case, of course, when President Trump indicated a withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, they indicated that they will independently and despite the federal government meet the obligations of the Paris Climate Accord. So I think that that politically, certainly cities are potentially very powerful actors in this space. If we look at the cities that have significant budgets that can be marshaled around alternative technologies and infrastructures to deal with carbon intensity and the material flow of cities, there's a lot that can be done. And of course, in some of the larger cities, they often, through their regulatory power, are able to influence the practice of private actors, particularly corporations, within their jurisdiction, which would be less likely to be the case in a rural municipality, for example, where you just wouldn't have that kind of political clout. So I'll make those few general comments, and then I don't know, Anton, if you want to come in maybe with some specific examples.
Yeah, thanks. So, I mean, everyone always asks for the example, and I don't think there is one. There isn't a definitive example of a city, certainly that we work with, that's getting this completely right. But there are pockets, including in Tanzania and Ghana and even in Ethiopia, where we see the sustainability agenda being driven by pragmatism, actually. And one of the things that I perhaps should have mentioned is that the history of mega projects like Grand Inga Hydra is not great, because they just tend to run over budget, run over time, deliver a very low level of service, and lock into technologies and financial models that don't actually suit the host country very well. And so I think simply for pragmatic reasons, there's something of a shift towards slightly smaller projects, slightly more decentralized, without the same mega infrastructure financing models behind them, so more financeable. And people are seeing this as a way of delivering services, as opposed to the historical approach. And I think that's for churches. That happens to combine very often with sort of more circular or renewable energy technology at the same time. That is the opportunity. The sort of I use the word leapfrogging so cautiously, because most of my childhood memories of leapfrogging ended up with me flat on my face, and it might not be so different for African countries, I think. But it's a compelling idea, and that's one we shouldn't let go of. And I think there is this potential to, particularly through renewable energy, to gain competitive advantage in a carbon-constrained global economy. Yeah, simply for pragmatic reasons and practical reasons. So, yeah.
Right, and one of the questions in the chat is actually related to that concept of leapfrogging. We have a question that asks, which development steps can be jumped regarding to national and climate-sensitive urban policies, if any?
Do you want to have a go at that, Edgar? Or?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so it's very difficult to answer some of these things in the generic, because the political economy of a given country and city is highly determinant as to what is possible. But I think if we, for a moment, just stick with cities and countries that operate off a low base and kind of has to do everything because of just the scale of need, from water and sanitation systems to mobility infrastructure, energy, and so forth. The critical issue is really a debate about what's the criteria for investment. So if you have a limited pot of resources for sort of a variety of complicated reasons, it is very important that the criteria for how you can allocate scarce resources is very clearly defined, and that's a political negotiation. So and to go back to some of the slides that I showed, so typically a lot of policymakers and political leaders equate leapfrogging with a kind of high-tech modernization, right? So they confuse these things. And actually leapfrogging could be low-tech, and as long as it is affordable to the largest proportion of the population. But that low tech is sufficiently technologically enabled that as income rises and as other technological solutions become possible, they're interoperable with large system-wide investments, right? So just to sort of say that it's not so much about being specific about where you should leapfrog and the technological choices you've got to make. It's about an approach and about making sure that the criteria of investment is made transparent and that it is contested. It is debated on the basis of evidence, and it is debated on the basis of an approach that says any future response should be consistent with a low carbon trajectory. It should be as inclusive as possible, which means affordable, and it has to be institutionally appropriate to the context. I'll leave it at that and ask Anton to share his reflections.
Yeah, those are great points, and I mean, the examples of that in mobility, right? Where it might be that this youth generation never owns a car, right? And that the idea of a car as a status symbol kind of falls away. That's one possibility. But I'll share to illustrate what Edgar was saying. I'll share an example that I'm actually working on at the moment in the city of Durban on the east coast of South Africa. So very local. Apologies for that. But a city that is subject to a periodic drought. Partly because of competing demands for water and growing demand for water from the city itself. And historically, the model has been to build new dams or even have some interbasin transfers of water, which are really clunky ways of providing water. And what they're doing now, or actually through a piece of research, I've worked out that soils, good soils in the upper catchment, store twice as much water. So soils with a healthy carbon-nitrogen ratio store twice as much water as all the dams in the catchment. Right? And yet so many of the activities are being encouraged through industrialization and through industrial agriculture and through urban expansion are actually destroying that quality soil, which is also a big water storage. And so the current approach, we call it ecological infrastructure for water security, focusing on the health of the catchment as a key determinant of providing enough water to the residents of the city of Durban. And again, this argument is being driven by two things really. One is that actually doing it this way turns out to be almost an order of magnitude cheaper than the next best option, which is groundwater abstraction. So it's just more affordable. And then crucially, and to a point that Edgar made in his presentation, it creates the type of work which unemployed people can do. It's not particularly high skilled. It can't be offshored easily. It's actually at the moment outdoors and safe. So that's really helpful in a kind of context of a global pandemic. And it actually links to a sense of place as well, because people work on a place and they can see what they've done, and it has multiple co-benefits. And for most people, it's just a job, that's the chief appeal. So those are attributes, as Edgar called them, which I think to solve a tricky urban problem, which is water security, but through a slightly different approach, by way of illustration. And I think that's replicable actually across a number of African cities. In Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, actually the same approach is used, but not so much to secure water, but to limit the impacts of flooding. And maybe I can link that point to one of the questions in the chat, which is around carbon accounting. This is a very difficult space, and whether it should be production or consumption based, I guess is a general question. We could apply to GDP as well. And just as GDP is a pretty hopeless metric for well-being, there are deep problems in carbon accounting, particularly in African countries, and particularly around charcoal, okay? And charcoal burning, which is a key source of fuel for preparing food. And it's actually charcoal and the deforestation that accompanies charcoal is one of the things that tends to slip out of most carbon accounting methods, because it's simply not counted. And actually, I think makes for a massive undercount of carbon footprints in African cities. But in Dar es Salaam, the destruction of forests upstream of the city to make charcoal is also a key source of flooding. And so you can imagine, if you like, not easy to do, but you can imagine a clean energy solution without the indoor air pollution, without the carbon, without the deforestation, and with reduced flooding in the city, if you can somehow substitute the charcoal that people use in their homes to prepare food. And that's the type of imaginary that I think we need to work towards. solution, yeah, if I can call it that.
Thank you for that. We have another question in the chat that asks about cities that are in civil conflict or in post-conflict phases. Perhaps they are unique cases for urban transitional strategies. Do you think there are good models of key approaches that are ideal for these conflict or post-conflict regions that brings us to this conversation of decarbonization?
That's a great question and really complicated. Yeah, so I don't have a particularly well formulated answer or response. But I think what is significant about conflict areas, of course, is that you've got what one could almost term a non-permanent forms of organization. So often in a case of a massive influx of refugees or people who've experienced forced migration of one sort or another, there has to be a humanitarian and emergency response. And this tends to take on the form of a special type of urban planning, really. And there's something about being able to respond quickly, act with a light touch, create mechanisms for people to maintain the area themselves with a relatively low cost structure, which I think is really helpful and instructive for thinking differently about how we intervene in what one could call slum areas or informal settlements. And essentially what sort of the literature tells us is that if one invests in the social infrastructure to do these more, if almost piecemeal, but more localized is a better word, forms of interventions to respond, for example, to flooding or to respond to energy insecurity and so forth, which can then be the basis for forms of social enterprise or social entrepreneurship. You build a slightly different economic entry point and model, but you also have a much more nimble mechanism and a much more affordable way to respond in these conditions. So I think there's something about this sort of cumulative history of disaster relief or emergency response that come from conflict areas that is still waiting translation into what it could mean for appropriate urban management and planning within informal settlement contexts. Yeah, so I mean, that's kind of just at a very abstracted level, a general response that I would have, but I don't know if Anton has any further thoughts, but a great question, yeah.
Yeah, a great question, and it's always tricky picking a post-conflict society in Africa, right? Because you never know they're about to lapse. But you know, maybe Rwanda is illustrative in some senses there. And to add Edgar's point around enterprise development, I also think there's just a place for the public works programs. Right? And one of the things that always gets forgotten in this rapid demographic shift is the public goods. The public goods, whether they're environmental or social or institutional, which kind of, you know, enable us all to keep going. And I think there is a model that allows people to find meaningful work, develop a sense of place, to develop an urban identity while working on public goods. Always in the African context anyway, constrained by the fiscus, right? There just isn't the resources to do this well. But there are examples of public work programs that have played that role, I think. Yeah.
Great, thanks. And as we, are very close to the end of our session, I think a lot of our attendees are hungry for ways that they can take action. We have hundreds of student climate activists from around the world, and I'd like to discuss the role of the citizen in driving this sustainable urbanization. And is there anything that students can do now to help these communities transition towards a more resilient infrastructure and towards these sustainable urbanization policies?
Why don't you go first, Anton, and maybe you want to.
So, I mean, I think that was my point, right? Is that I think there are 100 channels to work on this, which is what makes it exciting. But and maybe just picking up on the finance point in the chat, because I see it. You have to, and again, to Edgar's presentation, we have to reimagine the solution. Right? And in finance in particular, we know that what I like to call, it's slightly unfair on the institution itself, but it's slightly in the World Bank model where you borrow the money, you build the infrastructure, you provide the service, you charge the users, you repay the debt, and then you do it all again, right? That model doesn't plug and play in this context for levels, for reasons of low per capita income, weak local governance, uncoordinated governance, land tenure issues. So what is that finance model then that allows the money to land to get the things done that we have to get done, right? If we want to have any chance of achieving the SDGs, we have to get these basic things done: clean energy, water and sanitation, education, public health care in African cities, and meaningful work as well. So that's that's just one, right? But it opens up a whole raft of opportunities, particularly for people who are kind of looking at finance and financial policy. We just need to reinvent the wheel completely. And it needs to be different to the one we've got at the moment. Yeah, not reinvent the wheel, just reinvent the model. So yeah. But yeah, there are hundreds. So there's work to be done.
Yeah, so I think that picking up on Anton's point about, there's no shortage of work, maybe it's useful to just think of sort of different kinds of spectra that has to be kept in mind. So what we know is that the climate work means disrupting the status quo. It means continuously challenging and critiquing dominant policy and governance frameworks, and that does involve protest, direct action, and radical accountability. So that's a very important part of the spectrum, and there's a whole set of movements that have grown up to fulfill those functions, in all geographies and so forth. And increasingly, of course, they are networked and they're globalized and so on. However, the point is that once one has shifted the ground and new questions, new frameworks, new possibilities come to the surface, then you have to get into the really difficult work of reconfiguring dominant institutions, regulatory frameworks, incentive structures, et cetera, et cetera. And that you cannot do in the abstract. You cannot do that work simply with an oppositional mindset. You have to get into the murky world where you have to sit with those who you've been on the barricade against, those who are the biggest polluters, who are at the core of the problem, the private business and so forth. And you've got to co-produce both an analysis of, at a systems level, of the challenges and what are the most strategic and appropriate responses to that, and how you will create vehicles to deliver those solutions. And once you've designed those together, you then have to do the work, right? And you've got to account for that work. You've got to write it up. You've got to think about it. You've got to reflect on it and so forth. And so what we're talking about essentially is to maybe think less about doing this or that, but understanding that transformative change is a process that takes time. And one can enter that process at different moments in time, and it involves different skill sets. But the protest work is not somehow morally superior to the messy work of institutional design. They're both equally necessary and important. The critical issue is to retain, and I guess what this program is about, is to retain our critical faculties so that we can always ask the difficult questions, the deep questions, the transformative questions, whether we're in the protest mode or we're in the co-production mode. And so, sorry, Siri decided she wants to join the conversation. I have no idea why. That's the word protest, I think, that triggered something. It's literally playing some classical music now for some other reason. That is so bizarre. So now that Big Brother is listening and participating, let me just end off to say that I think, in a way, we are in our generation spoiled for choice because there's so much work to be done. And it is really important that we just find the right entry point. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Edgar and Anton for joining us this morning, this afternoon, wherever we find ourselves. We are so grateful to have gathered some of your insight. To the students watching from around the world, I hope you found some ideas that you might be able to apply to your own home cities. This recording will be made available on our YouTube channel, and feel free to revisit some of these ideas and enjoy the rest of the forum. Thanks again, Edgar and Anton.
You're welcome. Thank you for the opportunity. Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ashley.